First, I appreciate everybody coming out on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was coming back from the other building about 1:30 and it started to rain, and I thought, well, of course, it's Tuesday and our first Tuesday. So I appreciate you coming out today. We have Dr. Jim Jones. He's with the Tennessee Historical Commission. Today he'll be talking about his book, The Hidden History of the Civil War by Dr. Jones. And he has another book, Tennessee in the Civil War. It's contemporary accounts, selected accounts. And he has both of these books. Yeah, I appreciate him coming today. He was one of my professors in graduate school, and now that he no longer has the grade book, I can say he was a pretty good professor and mean it. And so the next first Tuesdays, let me get you March 4th is going to be my boss, Kent Oliver. He'll be talking about moving the Metro Archives. And if you don't have questions, I have a bunch, so just let me know. April the 1st, Judith Broadbent is going to talk about writing family history. She's written a book about hers. It has family stories, poetry, things like that. So she'll come and talk to you about how to get something like that started. That's April 1st. And in May, Sue Culbertson will come and talk about Tennessee literary luminaries. Sometime in March we may be moving, so I'll get with you all about that, we're going to continue the first Tuesdays, and we love having you do that. And so if you have thoughts on times, if you want to keep it at 2:30 to 3:30, let me know. If you want to move it to a lunch hour, let me know. Whatever y'all want to do, I'm open to any kind of thing we can do. We can keep it like it is. Right now, I'm not sure where we will meet. The archives will be on the 3rd floor of the main library downtown in the west wing of the library. And we'll be there, but where we meet, I'm not sure yet. But just follow along and we'll get a caravan together and figure it out. So without much else, I will turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Well, thank you very much. Boy, this is a crowd. I want to talk to you today about a lot of perhaps miscellaneous things, but how it was that I came to write this book, The Hidden History of Civil War Tennessee. Today's, the verse for today's history homily is from Gertrude Stein. She wrote, "There will never be anything more interesting than that American Civil War." Period. Nearly 2 decades have passed since I asked a knowledgeable colleague how many military engagements took place in Tennessee during the Civil War. It was just sort of an offhand question. He immediately piped up with an established answer provided by E.B. Long in his book, The Civil War Day by Day. And it was that there were 1,462 fights in the volunteer state during the Civil War. Second only to Virginia, he said in mock reverential tones. Using Long's figure of 1,462 cases of belligerency, an interesting estimate can be made that raises questions about the actual amount of time spent in combat. I assigned an arbitrary but I thought rational value to combat events, 2 weeks for big battles and an average of 3 hours to all other military conflicts. I found that the total number of hours of combat amounted to 4,386, or 183 days. But the total number of hours that Tennessee was involved in the Civil War amounted to 35,874, or 1,491 days. So the time spent in actual fighting was 12% of the total. Well, didn't anything else transpire in the rest of that time, the rest of the 88% of the time, or 1,308 days? After quadrupling the value of all combat to an unlikely average of 12 hours, only 48% of the time was spent in actual fighting. By these calculations, the actual time in combat appears at least to have been less than half. Consequently, even Nathan Bedford Forrest could rest and reload sometimes because he evidently had the time. These calculations kind of spurred my interest. And so I consulted Frederick H. Dyer's compendium for numbers and documentation. At first, I was delighted with this book of lists, but I soon found that Dyer offered neither sources nor tallies, only the briefest of descriptions that accounted only for federal units. More detailed research led to the general index of the National Park Service's study entitled Military Operations in the Civil War. This publication indicated the kind of military action that occurred at a given place and time. This was encouraging, but it provided a minimum of narrative value and did not go much on listing the military events and did not place them in any chronological order. Well, that's what I was looking for, an annotated list in a chronological order. I hadn't found a chronological documented list of martial conflicts in Tennessee with narration based upon the official records of the War of the Rebellion, or the OR as it's known. It was obvious to me that such a list didn't exist, and that it was up to me to do the work of the historian, to seek out new information and go boldly where many had gone before, to the OR, and produce such a register. At first, I intended to come up with a more accurate list of combat dates preceding the operational reports found within the OR, but these were keyed to 126 volumes and not directed to reports. One had to go to the individual volume reference for the citation. However, by pasting them together, I saw a limited chronology to emerge. So there was nothing left for me to do, really, but to count them. I reasoned that the only place to find information was in the OR's 2-volume index. It was a matter of counting beans. I went page by page, entry by entry, 7 times in all, and finally concluded that there was something over 1,700 separate instances of combat in Tennessee during the war. This list was matched to Dyer's list, which proved to be manifestly lacking by comparison. My documented list was bigger and documented, so I concluded that I had found the documentation with I could construct a narrated list. This meant keying in what seemed an endless number of reports on skirmishes, reconnaissances, bushwhacking, conscript sweeps, naval combat, and lesser events that were separate and distinct actions not mentioned in the OR index. These citations could be found next to impossible to enumerate without the aid of CD-ROM technology. I found that the official Army and Navy records provided excellent, credible accounts, but I still wanted independent verification. It's another thing historians like to get if they can. With better sources, what better sources than newspapers, directories, and correspondence, journals. These familiar sources did not provide many beans to count. They did, though, address the gloomy psychological aspects of the war on the home front, politics, persecution, displacement, and the plight of refugees, confiscation of property, guerrilla warfare, smuggling, inflation, currency and commodity speculation, food shortages, urban life, and a myriad of special and general orders not recorded in the OR, such as Special Order Number 7, issued in Memphis on July the 19th, 1862, just soon after the city fell to the Union. It says, drunkenness upon the streets has become so common that it is a disgrace to the army now occupying the city. Hereafter the sale of ale and lager is prohibited, blah, 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 blah. Just 2 weeks after they took the city, the place was just loaded with drunken Yankee soldiers. Likewise were topics in with public health, public education, the complexity of occupation, the roles played by women, religious and family life, murders, politics, the theater, juvenile delinquency, prostitution, hospitals, the liberation and shaping of the African American community, and the end of the effect of the war on children, to name but a few. There was more to the war in Tennessee than my neighbor's 11-year-old son put it, neat fighting stuff. In the end, I had construed a chronological list of documented narratives, a file on the computer that I called the big one. And that's what it was. So far, tabulations indicate 2,777 cases of combat in Civil War Tennessee. Until now, Virginia was held to be the state where most Civil War combat took place. The Old Dominion's total, according to Long, was 2,154, 623 less than the newly established total for Tennessee. So if nothing else, one may conclude that there was more fighting in the volunteer state than in any other state. And that being the case, it is possible to suggest, at least, that the war was won or lost in Tennessee, not Virginia. For those who may censure this finding with discriminating remarks with reference to quality versus quantity, I say quantity has a quality all its own. Virginia might regain its ascended place as the mother of all Civil War battles when someone heeds Casey Stengel's admonishment. You can look it up. The nature of the fighting in Tennessee was not characterized by large battles. Instead, combat was mostly on the smaller level of the skirmish, with 1,122, or roughly 40% of the total. The other 60% of combat operations were divided between affairs, reconnaissances, scouts, demonstrations, raids, guerrilla action, and what we might today call search and destroy missions, expeditions of various types, and of course, battles. The terminology for these kinds of combat activity defied any settled situation or its definition. Indeed, the reference desk at the West Point Library could find no such classification. Apparently, they knew what they knew, and they meant what they meant when they meant it. Could a skirmish be defined by the numbers of combatants? No. A skirmish could involve as few as 7 with no losses, or as many as 7,000 with the losses of up to 80 or 90. I'm going to do my Marco Rubio imitation here. The Tennessee total of 2,777 examples cannot represent an all-inclusive number of combat operations. For example, my findings show 58 citations under the word skirmishes, plural. Well, how many skirmishes? 15, 3, 13? Surely, how is a retreat, similarly, how is a retreat different from a withdrawal? There was no designation conscript sweep in any source. My references to conscripting activity were found serendipitously in official correspondence, newspaper reports, and journals. I have found nothing to indicate how conscription actually worked, except one hint that came from Brigadier General Gideon J. Pillow in January 1863, after the Battle of Stones River. As conscription officer for the Army of Tennessee, he reported to General Bragg that he had ordered his field commanders, quote, to rake Bedford County, in which there are 1,500 men liable to duty under the conscription law. I was anxious to clean out the whole county in one movement and have it done at once to avoid giving alarm. A partial movement over one portion of the county will give the alarm and cause the conscripts to scatter and hide out. So not only was there some reluctance on the part of some people to join the Army of Tennessee, but being conscripted was also more accurately a swift jolting experience with infantry or cavalrymen dragooning farm boys against their will. Why else would Pillow worry that they would scatter and hide out? Scattering and hiding out were contradictory to my own preconceived notions of Southern youth, eager to follow the rebel battle flag. Likewise was the opposition to the Confederate Army by some of the young men in the cities. There were anti-draft riots in Nashville. The topic of Confederate soldiers deserting the Army was another surprise to me. In January 1862 again, General Crittenden, now in Knoxville, had had enough of the situation, and he came up with a solution. He placed a guard on each train car going to or leaving Knoxville to arrest soldiers who had no furlough papers. Likewise, guards were stationed at all railroad bridges and major crossroads, charged with the same duty. Those returning for battle were ordered to report to Knoxville, where the city was under martial law. During January, so many soldiers were in Knoxville that retail liquor shops were closed, and the troops were being rapidly sent forward to their commands, and vigor and energy are infused into every department of the service. So things are sort of chaotic, at least in Knoxville. I found many startling insights, to me anyway, startling. One example was the general calm and resignation displayed in newspaper reports concerning the February 1861 vote to stay in the Union. There was no general alarm made. They seemed to not much care. And the secret nature of the business of the legislature was equally curious, especially after the awe-inspiring pro-union vote in February. Why was it a secret? What was it that they were talking about? What went on behind closed doors? Another insight revolved around the attempt of the state to finance its war effort. This was pitiful, even comical. Men of means and position agitated more about the transfer of state debt to the Confederate government and having it reimburse bondholders for expenses than they did about providing soldiers' needs, or for soldiers' needs. Easy for me to say. In late January 1862, it was obvious to the members of the Fayetteville Committee of Correspondence that volunteers from Lincoln County would get no winter clothing from the Confederate government. They wrote a truly touching letter to the Confederate Secretary of War offering to clothe them with uniforms manufactured in Fayetteville. Flush with hopes of huge profits, arms manufacturers promised officials the moon but could not deliver, forcing the governor to impound all civilian sport rifles for military use. The formation of juvenile gangs in the cities in 1864 and even earlier came also as a surprise. One gang, the 40 Thieves, originated in Louisville and spread down the railroads Chattanooga, Nashville, and even Atlanta. Another, the Mackerel Brigade, formed in Memphis. Turf battles were fought with rival gangs from New Orleans. One juvenile, a notorious thief, Melton Zachary, was sent to the city workhouse for stealing jewelry, an overcoat, 2 boxes of cheese, some brown sugar, a keg of butter, and a bale of rope. And that's just the one time they caught him. Also of interest was the magnitude of the illegal cotton trade in Memphis and Chattanooga and in Middle Tennessee. The editor of the daily Chattanooga Rebel was infuriated about it, as was General Sherman in Memphis. But the U.S. War Department, however, quietly sanctioned this practice. I guess some of the cotton mill owners needed the cotton mill more than we needed to stop them from buying guns. Inflated prices in currency and commodity speculation were common. Speculators were called vampires in the Confederate press. The anti-Semitism displayed by Grant and Sherman were previously unknown to me. It may be an onerous conclusion, but Nathan Bedford Forrest was defeated at least twice in Tennessee. The extent of guerrilla war, for example, was another insight. Activity and the extreme measures taken to suppress it were widespread. Home guard units on both sides often took on characteristics of terrorist gangs who were often in it only for the money. A cinematic portrayal of a home guard unit was made in the movie Cold Mountain, if you may have seen it. Colonel Fielding Hurst, for example, extorted more than $100,000 from the citizens of West Tennessee. He was a Union colonel, while his brother-in-law squeezed $15,000 of McNairy County alone. One example saw a regular Army of Tennessee officer caught behind rebel lines where he carried on the war by commanding guerrilla groups in Tennessee and Kentucky. That's his chapter in this book, by the way. But both Confederate and Federal line forces took political prisoners and hostages to extort loyalty. Evidence was found on the vigilance and behavior of the numerous committees of public safety in Memphis and Nashville. Such groups were as much mechanisms for slave and class management as instruments to appropriate the wealth of those who they believed were not PC, in this case politically Confederate. They vanished. These groups vanished once the federal armies took over and occupied the cities. Another episode dealt with the U.S. Army Medical Corps and prostitution. The practice was unquestionably a direct threat to the Army, and in 1863 in Nashville, officials exiled the courtesans to Louisville. The Cyprians were not welcome there, and they were sent back to Nashville. The only solution was to set up a legalized and licensed form of prostitution based on medical inspection. Memphis duplicated the system a year later. Additionally, the Army made strides in improving public health, constructing sewers, removing dead animals, rubbish, and offal from the streets, and enforcing smallpox inoculation. Crickets. Early in the war, the Southern Mothers formed in Memphis and in other cities to help sustain and nurse wounded Confederate troops. However, as disease and wounds festered, the well-mannered belles of Memphis were reluctant to continue in their role as caregivers. Slaves were called in to do that then. 64 bellicose belles of Gordonsville, Smith County, wrote to Governor Johnson in November 1862 for arms to put down the rebellion. "If you accept us," they wrote, "please send them immediately. If not, we will arm ourselves and bushwhack it," unquote. They were not at all like the pro-Confederate and wealthy Rebecca Carter Craighead of Nashville, who refused to take the oath of allegiance to the Union until she wanted to take a trip to New York City in the summer of 1864. She quickly swore the oath and took her trip, where she purchased a $400 dress and fine jewelry. One East Tennessee woman, angry at her husband had joined the Confederate Army, declared Lisa Strato-like, "Cussed if he ever sleeps in my bed again." There was poetry in the newspapers, as well as accounts of flag or sword presentations, humorous accounts of grand balls and camp life, and editorials complaining of prohibition, for example. The theater was active in the cities. In February 1864, John Wilkes Booth appeared in Nashville and got rave reviews. Who knew? An interesting comment on class consciousness is found in a letter from Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk to his wife, written in February 1863, soon after the Battle of Stones River. He mentioned that he promoted his son to his staff because the young man found the artillery captain to whom he was assigned too demanding. Polk sent his wife material and dress patterns. He complained that his staff officers were too busy seeking paramours about the countryside to write their reports of the Battle of Stones River. In Middle Tennessee, at least, a sort of sliding scale of class consciousness and prejudice existed in which the poorest whites resented the Confederacy for conscripting their sons to fight rich man's war. The middle class, while supportive of the Confederacy, was ambivalent. The richest were the most stalwart in their support for the rebellion and often sent Confederate forage parties to those of lesser status whom they considered traitors to the Confederate cause. In the months before the fiasco at Fort Donelson, slave owners were asked to supply slave labor to build fortifications. Few did, and some bragged about not complying. The forts were not built. It struck me as ironic that the very people who had the most to gain from the Confederacy refused to support it, and not only not out of any loyalty to the Union, but of a stingy and mean spirit of deception and duping the Confederate government. Other insights included an October 1863 proposal by Nashvilleian S.R. Cockrell to the Commissioner of the Confederate States for a 5-step strategy to harvest fish in Tennessee's rivers to feed the armies. The plan was considered visionary and was not implemented. In February 1865, the State of Tennessee Board of Commissioners met in Aberdeen, Mississippi. The men worked long and hard to establish an extensive schedule for prices for produce and army supplies to continue in force until altered, unquote. That there was virtually no Confederate authority in Tennessee in that late in the war apparently did not cross their minds. General Gideon Pillow, by the way, on 2 separate occasions, contacted federal commanders in Memphis, attempting to obtain safe passage so they might take care of his property within Union lines. Sherman suggested he take the oath of allegiance and he could come back. Another insight into the war was finding the location of the first recorded instance of actual fighting in Tennessee. You know, it had to start someplace. The site is on the Cumberland Plateau near the Kentucky border in Pickett County at a place called Travisville. This was a new finding to many historians and the natives in the area. In time, a historical marker was unveiled to an appreciative crowd and politicians. I compiled a 40-page booklet entitled A Documentary Guide to the Civil War on the Tennessee Cumberland Plateau, and given its limited run of 120 copies, was out of print in a week. This was an insight that led me to musings about history education, namely that of using documents and documentary evidence as a popular teaching tool. This reference book approach to the Tennessee Civil War could, I reasoned, have a more populist application. I thought that as a printed text, this kind of work would provide interest to people who have neither the time nor the research skills to find this data. But the big one, as I mentioned earlier, was too long to commit to paper. It's 6,500 or so pages. So I couldn't even begin. It'd be like the English dictionary, wouldn't it? The OED. The public had no familiarity with these documents because they are hard to find. Excuse me. Really, it's simply bewildering. This brings up the point of the professional versus a vocational expenditure of time it takes to construct research. In West Tennessee's Civil War history, there was a skirmish in June 30, 1862 at a place called Morning Sun. It was a Confederate victory. One constituent, an elderly enthusiast, said that he had spent most of his life looking for any information about the fight, but could not find it. Well, he didn't know where to look. And I knew where to look and provided him with that information within minutes. It wasn't so hard to find, but then I'm a historian and I had made the big list, or the big one. I knew where to consult. So, as it so happens, I have produced such a work of, he could have cut to the chase had there been a documentary guide to the Civil War in Tennessee for him to consult. And as it happens, I have produced such a guide, a pro bono service hosted graciously by the Tennessee State Library and Archives, called Tennessee Civil War Sourcebook. It can provide much information from what, if rendered in print, would cover over 6,500 pages. It is available to anyone with a computer. But documents and source books are one thing, while adding to the sesquicentennial Civil War narrative is another. I published a book I hoped would bridge that gap, a compilation of various documents, letters, journals, entries, etc., under the title of The Civil War in Tennessee. However, documents are not narratives, but the stuff of narratives. I reasoned that if I wanted to make a meaningful contribution to the Tennessee Civil War story, I would have to write documented stories about interesting examples of seemingly surreptitious history. The result of that revelation is the hidden history of Civil War Tennessee. It covers a number of topics not found in bookshelves today. It was important, I believe, that these essays chronicle episodes other than big battles and famous generals wherever possible. It'd be like gilding the lily, I suppose. Thus, the topics of committees of safety, the control of prostitution, the battle for public health, Nagley's raid on Chattanooga, and Sherman's occupation of Memphis would be the meat of the book. The hidden history of the Civil War in Tennessee, Civil War Tennessee, is the result of that effort, brought to print nearly 2 decades after I asked my friend how many fights took place in Tennessee during the war. The book cannot be called comprehensive, but it presents a diversity that can help shift emphasis away from the fixation on neat fighting stuff. It may help to lead to better understanding of the complexity of the war. It should serve an educational task and maybe even attenuate what one writer identifies as the neo-Confederate mentality that dominates the Civil War interpretation. That approach construes the war as a uniformly white male Southern heritage. We need to be wary of the heritage syndrome, or an inclination to promote what is charismatic or pleasing and to discount the rest. History and heritage, it follows, are two different things. It might be best to reflect on the phrase, "We weren't there, we didn't do that." The counterfactual way of interpretation, using "what if," should be avoided. History is by definition irrevocable. This book, The Hidden History of Civil War Tennessee, presents essays to assist the reader to reach an understanding that there is more to the Civil War than before. It is composed of narratives that were hidden because of the emphasis on famous generals and big battles. I've heard it said that what gets into history gets there because of what got left out. The Hidden History represents some of those stories that got left out. It is intended to give the reader the view, as none other than Harry S. Truman once said, "The only thing new in the world is the history you don't know." Thank you.